introduction of Dr. Mathew. It's a huge honor having you here with us. I know you've given talks all over the world, and so I'm super glad that you were able to leave your kids, bend your schedule, and come talk to us. So Sarah got her undergrad degree at Princeton in ecology and evolutionary biology. Then she did PhD with Rob Boyd at UCLA, completing that in 2011. Followed that with postdoc in Stockholm at the Center for the Study of Cultural Evolution, and then was tapped by Arizona State University, where she works at the Institute of Human Origins. She's an associate professor now. And her honors and awards include an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship, which was on current and future challenges to U.S. democracy and the international order. She's got tons of grants from NSF, NIH, Pipe Foundations, lots of pubs in such prestigious places as PNAS, Religion, Brain and Behavior, Nature, Human Behavior, Nature Communications, Behavior and Brain Sciences. So y'all should check out some of those. She's served as president of the Cultural Evolution Society, which she helped to found. And she's done in-depth field work on the Turkana of Kenya. And in my class, we were just learning about the thought processes that went into your choice of the Turkana. And that really brought me back like 40 years when I chose the Dogon. I literally went through a very parallel decision-making process. And so I thought, even though we operate in different kind of thought streams in the field of evolution and human behavior, we're maybe not too dissimilar, since we went through the same sort of genesis back in the day. Anyway, very happy to formally introduce you.
Thank you. Thanks, Beverly, for the introduction. And I will remember to turn on my mic. First off, I think that actually some of the things that I do might sound really different from human behavioral ecology, but I think it rests on a very rich theoretical foundation that has been brought into anthropology by human behavioral ecology, that is thinking about how individual interests can be useful for us to explain larger processes. I also want to say thanks to all the students who asked really good questions in the last hour and got me really warmed up. So that's been great. I hope to actually replicate something like this in my institution when I go back. I'm going to jump straight into the ethnographic context to give you a little bit of a flavor for what life is like here. So this is a watering point. It's a dry season river bed. And this family over here has probably grazed their herds up in the mountains that you see in the picture. These are the Mogilla Mountains. And by midday or so, they make their way into the riverbed and water their animals. And they are not the only people who would like to, so the mountains over there have really good pastures during the dry season that the other places don't have. So definitely it's very valuable to be able to have access to that land, but they're not the only people who want to graze their animals over there. On the other side of this mountain is South Sudan, literally. Over there in South Sudan is another pastoral group called the Toposa. And the Toposa also in the dry season want to use the same scarce and rich dry season grazing areas that are up there in the Mogilla Mountains. And in addition to this family here, this family belongs to a particular subterritory of the Turkana called the Kwatela. In addition to them, there are other Turkana let's say from neighboring territorial sections of the Turkana, the Lukumong, who also want to use this dry season area. If you will see, one of the men back there is holding an AK-47, and he needs that in order to be able to defend his herds from raids that could be launched against them, cattle stealing missions, cattle raids in which they could lose all their livestock. And that gets me to the larger point that there is cattle raiding in this area of Kenya. And these are raids in which large numbers of people mobilize and they go and try to acquire cattle from neighboring groups. Along the border region, individuals bear substantial costs to go on these raids. So 40% of men have bullet injuries in the population that I've interviewed. The average mortality per raid is about 1%. 50% of adult male mortality is due to warfare because people go on these raids multiple times in their life. Not only do they go on these raids, but they also get attacked by the Taposa. And so about half of that mortality happens in the context of defense. And if you look across both adult and children, basically 1 out of 5 of every male child who's born will end up getting killed in war. This is along the border region with the other ethnic groups. It's not true for the Turkana that live in the interior. But what it's showing is that individuals are taking on pretty substantial costs when they're participating in these raids and being attacked. There are incentives to free ride, so people will report things like, about their fellow combatants. They'll say they were not firing, they were running away, or instead of them coming forward and firing the bullets, they were staying in the back and firing. So you get the typical kinds of problems that you get when you're mobilizing a large number of people to go and wage war, and the benefits of these activities are distributed in a broader group of people than the people who are just fighting. Despite these risks that they take, and despite the fact that there is a strong potential for free riding, raiding parties are not just comprised of the people that are your close kin or the people that you know very well and can have these more direct reciprocity type relationships with. Instead, the raiding party is comprised of about, on average, 300 people. Some raids are even larger. And very few of the raiding party will be close kin and people that you know very well. So somehow they're able to undertake this, large-scale cooperative enterprise that's pretty high stakes, in a way that surpasses the type of cooperation that you get with kin and close associates. And it's also that multiple segments of Turkana society are coming together to go on these raids. So people come from different territorial sections, different settlements, different age groups. And usually people have most of their strong social ties within these kinds of social groupings. So when you put people from multiple of these social groupings together, there'll definitely be a lot of people who you don't really know much about, yet you are going on a raid with them in which there's a pretty high chance, 1 out of 100 it's a very high probability that you will get killed, right? So in some ways, that's a pretty spectacularly high level of cooperation that you're getting in a large group. So what is sustaining this type of cooperation? One of the key mechanisms by which humans are able to cooperate beyond the scale of kin, beyond the scale of people that they know, and they know how these people treated them in the past, that's direct reciprocity. the way that we can get cooperation beyond the scale is usually through norms and the enforcement of norms. So mechanisms like indirect reciprocity and third-party punishment are ways in which humans are able to sustain this type of large-scale cooperation. And we see exactly those kinds of mechanisms at play here in the Turkana. So this is a vignette study in which I present participants with hypothetical scenarios in which it's a culturally relevant hypothetical scenario. So in one scenario, warriors are going on a raid, and there's one individual who basically lags behind the others because he's afraid of the risks, doesn't want to get shot. And in another, a warrior who actually similarly doesn't contribute to the raiding effort, but this is because of his lack of skill. So he tries, he puts himself out there, but he just doesn't have, he's not a sharpshooter, and he is unable to actually help achieve the larger goal. And so in other words, the cowardice is basically free riding. That is, you're reducing your private cost in this activity, whereas the second one is about your lack of ability rather than lack of effort. So people do have strong sentiments towards warriors, much stronger negative sentiments towards warriors who exhibit cowardice than those who exhibit lack of skill. So they are much more likely to think that's wrong, be displeased with this person, be willing to criticize this person, think that this person should be punished, and also withdraw social interactions with this person. So not be next to this person in a raid, but also not entrust your herd with this person. So you're not going to ask this person for help. You're also not going to help this person when they need help. So you're more likely to refuse to lend them an animal when they need to, rebuild their herd because their herd gets destroyed in famines and raids and floods, epidemics. So if you exhibit cowardice on a raid, people are more likely to directly sanction you, but also you'll experience indirect costs that are associated with the fact that you are kind of violating a social norm. And I like the contrast with the unskilled warrior because sometimes we think, well, this can all be explained without any norms because, why would I want to give my daughter in marriage to somebody who's a coward? Well, why would you want to give your daughter to somebody to marry who's also an unskilled warrior, right? So this, there's something about the fact that being a coward is a type of free riding, that there are norms against that kind of free riding that is making people willing to sanction that particular act and not some other act that has similar effects on the success of the group. Now, these kinds of sentiments do result in real-world behavior in which when there were raids in which people reported that there's cowardice or desertion, they report that in some of those instances, not all of them, some violations go unnoticed and nobody does anything about it, but some of the times people will talk, make a big deal about it, and start criticizing that person directly, talking about that person. So that's all listed under verbal sanctions. And a subset of that will go on to have fines imposed on them. So a fine is when you're asked to sacrifice animals from your herd for kind of making up for that violation, atoning for that violation. And in some instances, your age mates will basically get together as a group and they will punish you by beating you, whipping you, and the goal of that is to educate, disciplining for the sake of correcting their behavior. So it's not seen by them as a form of violence, but is seen by them as a form of bringing somebody back into the fold by disciplining them. And in red are basically instances in which these were violations in large-scale raids, in green, stealth raids, and you can see that punishment tends to be more common. These higher level punishments tend to be more common when you have violations on large raids, presumably because in the smaller raids, you have other mechanisms also at play, like direct reciprocity, right? So if somebody was bad on a particular stealth raid, next time you can choose not to go with them. You can choose to find somebody else. And so there's potentially other mechanisms that can keep that cooperation, but the large scale raids really requires the enforcement by peers. So this is decentralized types of peer punishment in which no single individual in this community has the authority to punish another individual or make another individual go on a raid or not go on a raid. All of this is only possible when you have a collective kind of consensus that, oh, this person has done something wrong, and then communally, as a group, people are willing to impose these kinds of social sanctions. So this part focused on the question of how humans get large-scale cooperation, and this is a small window into one particular context of human cooperation. That's the context of warfare in large groups. And we see that the sentiments that sentiments of social disapproval and the desire to enforce punishment on somebody who's violated a norm is there, and it potentially plays a big role in why somebody might subject themselves to the risks of combat, because you did see that those risks are pretty profound. It's a pretty high stakes kind of cooperation, and you could actually do really well if you go on the raid and you're a laggard, because you're not subjecting yourself to the risk, but you'll be one of the first people who gets access to those animals as they're getting driven away. You can scoop off a big share of the animals, and that's what you would get if if there weren't social norms that prevented people from engaging in this type of behavior. So one of the things that I've emphasized is that while you have mechanisms like norm enforcement in humans that allow us to do this really spectacular thing, which you don't get in any other species, the ability to cooperate in large groups of unrelated individuals, even though we don't necessarily know everybody's history. We're able to do that, and we're able to do that even when we don't have centralized state authority, and that is happening through the presence of norms and the willingness of peers to participate in the enforcement of norms through indirect sanctions and through direct sanctions. So that is a spectacular solution that humans have that allows us to create all kinds of social institutions and social norms in a variety of different contexts and different systems, different cultural systems. And in some ways that underlies the type of social variation that you see across human societies, right? These are different societies have different social institutions that make us do very different things, that reward us for doing very different things. Some of those things that we would not want to do if there weren't that social norm pushing us in that direction. Now, that though can't be the full, it's definitely a very important part of the problem, but this solution creates new problems that we then need to explain. And in order to give you a little taste for what I'm talking about, I'm going to describe one particular vignette experiment that I conducted. So in green there, that's roughly the area of the Quatela people of the Turkana. So this is one of the subterritories of the Turkana, and they are a large group of people. They are about 50,000 to 100,000 people. So if you saw cooperation in the Quatela sustained by norms, you would say, check mark, humans have large-scale cooperation, all is good, right? You'd be very impressed. You should be very impressed. Without any centralized authority. So the Quatela are the subjects in this study. And in this vignette, I basically have presented the Quatela subjects with a scenario in which two Quatela warriors are going off on a stealth raid to the Toposa to raid animals from the Toposa. And they come back, and then, you know, there's celebration, and those animals get shared with other Quatela individuals. So if you want to think about a set of people who are benefiting from this action, it's the Quatela community is benefiting from this. To another group of Quatela participants, I presented them with a scenario in which Quatela warriors are going off to the Lukumong, the same distance away, and raiding animals from the Lukumong, bringing them back, not keeping it for themselves, but, you know, a lot of times when you come back from a raid, you got to give animals here, there, everywhere, and that's what they're doing. So again, the Quatela people are benefiting from this activity of these warriors, these Quatela warriors. But the Quatela people have very different responses to these two warriors. They have strong negative reactions towards the warriors who go to the Lukumong and raid animals, even though this group of people, the Quatela, are benefiting from it. But they don't have similar sentiments towards the warriors who go and raid the Toposa. Most of the time, they think that those people should be praised, honored. We need to sing for them. We need to have a feast celebrating them, etc. So even though the benefit to this large group of people, the Quatela, was the same in both these contexts, you have very different reactions because you have a norm that somehow exists that the Quatela people are adhering to that tells them that the Lukumong people need to be part of this bigger group of people whose interests you need to consider. You can't raid from the Lukumong even if it benefits you. You can go raid from the Toposa. When you ask them about the logic of going to raid from the Toposa, it's all about, you know, yes, we need those animals. Well, when you think about the logic of going to the Lukumong, you don't think about the logic of we need those animals. You just think that's wrong. I can't do that, right? So somehow their norms have a particular social scale at which those norms are conferring benefits to people. And in this case, those norms are creating benefits that extend to include some larger group of people that's not just the Quatela. So the Quatela will give up benefits for the sake of a larger entity. And those norms basically don't include another group of people, the Toposa. So when explaining, so when we have norms and norm enforcement, we can enforce any kind of norm, and those norms can operate at many different social scales. Like you can have norms that say, you know, it's okay to go and steal animals from another tribe, but people of your own tribe, that's a no. You can have norms that say, go and raid animals from another clan, but not your own clan. And all these things will create cooperation at very different scales. One at the scale of clans, the other at the scale of the tribe. And we need to have some explanation then for why it is that we have norms of a particular structure, norms that provide benefits at certain social scales, at the expense of smaller social scales, and at the expense of bigger social scales. So what you see in the Turkana is that they don't consider the benefits of that accrue at the larger social scale that includes the Toposa, right? Because if they did, they wouldn't raid the Toposa, they wouldn't, and both sides wouldn't lose so many people in conflict. It's certainly not an efficient way to interact when this many people have to die to get access to land and cattle. But the norm is creating, the particular structure of the norm is creating a world that shapes how people are, who people are benefiting, who people are harming. And it structures how people live and die. So this is the mortality in a place in which everybody's walking around with AK-47s and could potentially get into fights with each other. They do get into fights with fellow group members all the time. But the mortality from internal violence is about 2%. That is Turkana being killed by another Turkana. And the mortality from external warfare, that is Turkana and non-Turkana, is about 50%. So that is a vast difference that is being generated exactly by the norm that you just saw earlier on. So one of the mechanisms then by which we can understand what is the social scale at which norms kind of confer cooperative benefits is a mechanism called group-structured cultural selection, also called cultural group selection by some folks. And the basic idea is that when you get competition between groups with different cultural norms, so these are groups that are at different equilibria, normative equilibria in some ways, competition between these groups will lead to the spread of the normative system of the successful group. Okay? And this process is interesting because it is a mechanism that preferentially generates or favors norms that increase a group's success in between group competition. So groups that can expand because of this are groups that are going to be more likely to have norms that make them more able to outcompete other groups in the context of warfare, or outcompete other groups through having higher rates of cooperation by which they can grow and thrive, etc. So norms promoting large-scale cooperation and social order are going to be, we need this process to be able to explain the particular scale of large-scale cooperation and how you get preferentially norms that help you sustain social institutions that are compatible to cooperation and social order. So one of the assumptions of cultural group selection is that there is between group variation in cultural traits. That is an assumption that is necessary because without that variation, you do not have between group selection. The strength of between group selection is going to depend on the extent of between group variation. And a key outcome of this process is that it will lead to norms that benefit adherence of the cultural trait under selection at the expense of smaller or larger social scales. Smaller social scales in this example would have been just the Quatella. Larger scales would have been the Quatella plus the Toposa. But we want to explain the particular social scale that we saw, which is Quatella plus Lucumong, but not the Toposa, right? So to give you a closer look on how this process works. So let's imagine that you have groups structured like this, and you have blue and red cultural traits. The blue cultural trait is basic, or the red cultural trait is a non-cooperative norm. It says, help people that I know. Okay, that's a kind of cooperation, but it's telling you, if it's somebody you don't know, you don't need to help them. It's a more parochial kind of cooperation. And in blue, you have another cooperative norm that says, help or don't harm people who adhere to the same norm variant as I do. Okay? So these are both norms about cooperation, but they're going to have different outcomes. And what's going to happen is if we start in a world where people are kind of spread out between these different groups, when people move between these different groups, what's going to happen is they'll suffer a social cost. If you're a blue type living in a red world, you're going to suffer a social cost. So because it's a cultural trait, you can switch your trait in the middle of your life, whenever, right? So people can move between groups as much as they want, but they're still going to switch to the behavior that gives them the best payoff in that group, which is the common behavior in that group, because that's the norm that's getting enforced. So lots of movement can still allow for between group variation. That is, there are groups of the blue type. There are groups in which you have one norm. There are groups in which you have the other norm. You have different equilibria. And if the blue norm, which says, don't just help people you know, but help anybody who shares this variant of the norm that I have, that if that norm is about, it's quite likely that that norm can generate more success, because if there are benefits to cooperation, those benefits are being experienced to a greater extent by a greater number of people within that group, right? This is a norm that is generating higher levels of cooperation. So if the blue group basically is more successful because of their more expansive cooperative norm, they can take over other groups that have the less cooperative norm. And a couple interesting things happen here. So one is, now you see blue across three groups. And if you remember the blue trait is one that says, help anybody who shares the same norm variant as I do. So now what you've gotten is cooperation at a much bigger scale. There's cooperation across social boundaries that previously people were not cooperating across. So the scale of the cooperation has gone up. A second thing is that there is a correspondence between the scale. Now, this bigger circle is telling you the scale at which people are now cooperating. And it also then corresponds with the scale at which you get the cultural differentiation. That is, now this larger complex has one normative system that makes them different from this other complex that's in another normative system. So the scale of cooperation goes up, and you see that this process generates a coincidence, a correspondence between the scale of cooperation and the scale of cultural variation. So previously, cultural variation was at these smaller groups. Now cultural variation is at this different boundary, okay? So that is exactly what we are testing. We are testing these, the one key prediction is that you get high levels of cultural differentiation in humans' social groups. And we're using the statistic called cultural FST, which is simply the proportion of variation in a behavior that is between groups versus the total variation in that behavior. So that becomes higher the more that variation is structured into groups than spread out across individuals in the population. So high FST is something that's conducive to cultural group selection. And then we are testing a prediction, the prediction that I just showed you, which is that the social scale of cooperation should correspond to the social scale at which you get cultural differentiation. So this is work I did with Carla Handley, who was a postdoctoral researcher with me at the time. And we sampled people from a big chunk of Northwest Kenya, all of whom were pastoralists. So we had the Borana, we had 2 clans of the Borana in our sample, 2 clans of the Rendile, 2 clans of the Samburu, and 3 different clans of the Turkana. And because the Turkana additionally have these sub-territories, we also looked at 3 different sub-territories of the Turkana. So these are social groupings that people live in, nested social groupings. So clans are within ethnic groups, territorial sections are within ethnic groups, and there are ethnic groups. And then there's this broader pastoral, so semi-arid pastoral social complex that defines all of them. And what we're doing is we're measuring what is the scale at which you're seeing cultural differentiation. And for this, we identified 49 cultural traits. These are norms, beliefs that we ask subjects if they agree or disagree with. So if they agree, they consider it as having the trait. These spanned a whole range of domains of livelihood, pastoral livelihood, cooperation, rating, cultural markers, punishment, family relations. And we developed these vignette scenarios in which we try to test the second part, which is what is the social scale at which the norm is asking people to help. So we're varying for, and these are realistic scenarios in which somebody might need help, or somebody, you can choose to harm somebody, like steal their goat, not return their goat, not give them back money that you got when selling your animals, etc. But we're varying who the target is and whether the target is the same clan as the actor, a different clan as the actor, a different ethnic group as the actor, or a different territorial section as the actor. Subjects are third parties. They're not the actor, and neither are they the target. They're just people who are saying, what is the actor expected to do? What's the right thing for the actor to do? So essentially, we're just trying to get at what is the norm here, because our prediction is about the norm. And it's the rule, the focus here is not on what the rule is, but who the rule applies to, okay? And our results, the first question is, to what extent is there between group variation? And we found that we do get cultural FST levels that are substantially high between different ethnic groups. So that's the bars in brown orange at the bottom. Those are the pairwise cultural differentiation between ethnic groups. You don't get that much cultural differentiation between sub-territories and between different clans in this particular social space. In other places, you might find a different pattern. This is not to say that this is a cross-culturally consistent thing. It's that in this particular context, cultural variation is pronounced at the ethno-linguistic scale. And then the question is, the prediction was that, so is that then the scale at which you get cooperative norms? And what we find is that when you look at the predicted probability of cooperation, which essentially is, did the subject say that the actor is obligated to help the target, that's your y-axis, And in the model, we find that cultural FST has a big and significant effect on whether somebody says that, yes, the actor needs to help the target, which means that the norms are such that you are expected, that people expect you to help somebody of a similar cultural group to you. And the expectation, the social expectation goes down when you start getting to a different cultural group, a cultural group that is different from yours. And geographic distance did not have the same kind of effect. So if you're thinking that people cooperate more with people that they are more likely to see, that they're more likely to have interacted with in the market, you should see that geographic distance has a strong effect, but it does not have a strong effect controlling for cultural FST. So in other words, if you were to think about it in a less abstract way, the Turkana, for instance, will say that you're supposed to help a Turkana who lives 400 miles to your south if they came up and asked you for help, than you are to have to help a Samburu who lives 30 kilometers away. So distance is not the predictor, but cultural similarity is your predictor for whether there is a norm that's supporting cooperation at that scale. So this mechanism is important because it's what you need to be able to explain how norms promoting cooperative interactions in these big transient groups of people that are not seeing each other all the time, how does that kind of cooperative, how do those kinds of cooperative norms evolve? And cultural group selection is providing an explanation for that, which we don't have if we only think about indirect reciprocity and punishment. Why the social scale of norms in humans is both expansive but also limited. So we can't just freely expand the social scale at which we cooperate. In fact, there's very much need and value for extending the scale at which humans cooperate to solve bigger global scale challenges. But that's not easy to do, and it's not coming about. We can't just sit and think we want that and get it. It's because we don't have the norms that have evolved that are producing that are motivating us to produce social benefits at these larger scales. So in other words, humans can cooperate with millions or billions of people, but in a culturally parochial sort of way. Now, in the last bit, I will talk about how these norms, how living in a world in which norms were part of the social ecology of humans has potentially shaped the human psychology. And I'll do it in the context of combat-related post-traumatic stress disorder in the Turkana. This is work that I did with Matt Zefferman, who was also a postdoc with me at the time. And PTSD in evolutionary thinking is considered to be an overlearned survival response to near-death experiences that that will help protect you from either experiencing those things or better reacting to those kinds of dangers in the future. But a puzzling thing about that is that people have seen that drone pilots, so basically sitting in the safety of a room, very far from the combat situation, but they're basically targeting and killing people on the computer, real people, experience pretty high rates of PTSD. So clearly, this explanation is not a full explanation, but the question is, can we think about a richer evolutionary explanation for the breadth of situations in which people experience PTSD? PTSD has a range of symptoms, 20 symptoms that are used to categorize somebody as having a PTSD, provisional PTSD diagnosis or not. And what we decided was that some of these symptoms look very different from other symptoms, right? So the symptoms there on the left, memories, nightmares, flashbacks, acute distress, hypervigilance, startle, these are responses that make sense if you're thinking about learning and reacting to danger. But these on the top right don't seem to be associated with quick response and learning to physical danger, but they potentially are ways in which humans are mitigating the social risks of engaging in warfare. That is, the risk of having committed a norm violation and then being subject to the social disapproval that comes from it. So we labeled these symptoms in different categories, learning and reacting versus depressive symptoms. We didn't have much to say about some set of symptoms that we felt were either mixed or unclear what their function would be. So that's down there. But what we found when we went to the Turkana warriors and did the DSM-5 questionnaire with them is that there are high rates of PTSD. They'd never heard of PTSD before, never heard of combat-related PTSD, yet they described symptoms that look exactly like what you would get if you were to interview combatants in the US, combat veterans in the US. And 28% of the warriors would have qualified for a PTSD diagnosis, provisional PTSD diagnosis, based on their severity. Those are shown in red. Interestingly, when we compare Turkana warrior symptoms with that of American soldiers, we see that they have similar rates of the learning and reacting symptoms, but the symptoms in blue are under this 45-degree line, which means that American soldiers have relatively higher rates of those symptoms than Turkana warriors. Okay, if it's along the line, those symptoms are roughly occurring at similar rates in both populations. So both groups experience PTSD, but the symptom profile looks different. Now, the Turkana, so the depressive symptoms are what we said have to do with the social risks, mitigating the social risks of joining warfare. And there are many kind of cultural factors that are the normative landscape for warfare in the Turkana versus the US is very different. There's more moral autonomy for soldiers in the Turkana. There's less norms against collateral damage. There's more community endorsement for warriors, including for killing. And there's more of a alignment between civilian and military norms in the Turkana, all of which make it less of a morally risky space for a warrior to go out and do things in war, such as killing. And so that's why we hypothesize that the depressive symptoms are lower in the Turkana. And we have some preliminary evidence that supports that, because within the Turkana, we see that exposure to moral violations has a stronger effect on explaining the depressive symptoms than the learning and reacting. And combat exposure, that is exposure to the physical risks of war, has a relatively stronger effect on explaining learning and reacting symptoms than the depressive symptoms. So within the Turkana, a person who has experienced more moral violations in war is more likely to have depressive symptoms. So to conclude, the evolved psychology of combat-related fear response is prepared to mitigate not just the physical danger of warfare, but also the moral danger, that is the danger from damage from committing norm violations. And this implies that our combat psychology, PTSD, is an evolved response to mitigating dangers. That psychology has evolved in a world that is structured by cultural norms, a world in which the way that we participate in war comes from rules, norms that are socially enforced about what is right and what is wrong. And that's why we come prepared to monitor and be vigilant to that danger of violating those norms. and we become sensitive to express these symptoms in the context of warfare. So that is all I have, and hopefully I haven't run over too much. Okay.
Great.
Thank you.
So I'm sure Dr. Mathew will take questions. While they're thinking of their questions, I actually have one. Let's say a Karamajong is a coward. Does that directly impact the distribution of cattle that he would get? So I don't really know if I follow how are the cattle distributed after
Yeah.
age. I assume he gets less or
So the-
nothing.
Yeah, the Turkana.
Turkana.
Yeah. So the way that loot is divided is kind of interesting. What happens is when it's done in the culturally endorsed sort of way, it's that they give portions of the loot to every age group, and then age mates have to divide it among themselves. Senior age groups will get a bigger chunk than juniors, but within an age group, they're supposed to divide it equally, or give an extra to somebody who didn't get one, got one less in the previous raid, or who has a bigger need. They usually will not reduce the loot. There's only one instance in which that was the way the person was punished. Rather, they, and partly this is because in order to detect that somebody has done a violation, that happens after the raid. When people go back, people will talk, they'll say a bunch of stuff. Some will say, oh, you know, he did this. Others will say, oh, no, I saw him. He was, you know, actually, he was about to get shot. That's why he ran. Or, yeah, people bring up a lot of things and there's a lot of talk. And it's through this process of talking that people make a decision and some consensus emerges about whether a violation actually happened. And then there is the punishment, which is a fine that is imposed as a kind of atonement for the violation. And then there's beating, and during the beating, there's a lot of disciplinary measures that are meant for correcting, like telling him what he should be doing next time and things like that. So it's not, you can imagine that that would be one way that they could impose the fine, but that's not usually the way that they impose the fine.
I mean, I would imagine that if they're hungry, that being fined a cow or bull or whatever they are would be a lot worse than having some bad gossip. But I know gossip can be pretty harmful too.
Yeah, yeah. So it would be more costly if they were just told, "Okay, you're not getting a share of the loot," right? That's what you're saying. Rather than it goes back into this thing, there's gossip, and sometimes the gossip leads up to suggest that, oh, you do need to beat him, but sometimes they'll say, this is the first time he's done it. So let's, you know, watch him or give him a warning or things like that. And so it's less costly, but I think the goal of this mechanism is not to just slap on the biggest cost. It's more about it's a combination of encouraging and punishing in a way that you're telling this person that in order to be part of us again, you kind of need to do this, and we're kind of disciplining you rather than just smacking a one-time fine on you. It's a process. And if that process has to be done in a legitimate kind of way that's viewed as a kind of moral intervention as opposed to just the act of physical punishment, it has to go through this kind of community talk process. And in fact, if somebody just saw a violator doing something on a raid and went ahead and beat him by himself, people will say that's not correction, that's not discipline, that's not about right and wrong. This is about a fight between two people. So it kind of has to go through this consensus building stage and a collective kind of participation in the social norm enforcement for it to be considered, you know, an enforcement.
Thank you for the talk. If I'm tracking the general theme or approach that you're taking in the first part of the talk, you're not just predicting like in-group, out-group differences in cooperation. It's more that there's some kind of shared cultural value or norm. And I'm just wondering, what is that? So you have like a whole list of things that you looked at in terms of like dimensions of similarity or like features of similarity. But shouldn't it be certain ones that matter?
Shouldn't it be what?
Shouldn't it be certain values or features that matter, not all of them? And so what are those that you think are particularly important?
Yeah, so you're talking about the 49 traits that we identified. Yeah, so that's a great question, which kind of gets into the underbelly of the complexity here, which is that it's true. In theories, it's certain norms that should matter. It's certain norms that are going to spread at the that make a group more successful in intergroup competition, and those are over time. Those are the norms that we should preferentially see spreading. The problem is that we never know exactly what is the norm that is making a group more successful. And even if we think we have the norm, it could be some feature about the norm that we don't pick up on. Like, for instance, the Turkana punish cowards, even if they're 50 years old, whereas the Samburu, they only have their Morans go to war, and even though they punish their young Morans, they would never punish a senior elder, but the Turkana do. Is it that makes the Turkana's raiding more successful than the Samburu? Or is that a trait that's just along for the ride, that's closely correlated with some other trait? And I think that it's very, very hard to be able to tease those apart. So the strategy we are using is we're basically just looking for a bunch of cultural traits that travel together as a cultural package, and presumably those tie in to the traits that would be part of the set of traits that are actually under selection. But I will say that when we split up our traits by categories, so we had punishment, we had rating, cooperation, family dynamics, and cultural markers, the subset of traits that had the strongest effect on the result was warfare-related traits. And that makes sense in this particular context because a lot of the movement of the population boundaries, like the place that I work in, where I showed you the big green cuartela, none of that space 40 years ago was part of the Turkana. The Toposa lived all the way down to that spot. But over the last 40 years, the boundary has somehow shifted, and I think that, the warfare is, in this particular context, a big driver for group success. It doesn't have to be that way in some other context where you could have economic success and prosperity and other kinds of things that might be driving the group success.
Could you put up that slide that went by too fast for me, the one with the different PTSD symptoms?
This one?
Yeah, please leave that up
Yes.
while you answer other
Okay.
questions. Okay, thank you.
This might be a naive question, but I think you showed the Toposa people were across the boundary into South Sudan. So I wondered, to what extent is a geopolitical boundary part of the othering or just definition of insiders and outsiders?
Yeah, so it's true that in this particular example, the Toposa mapped onto a geopolitical boundary, but you have very similar kinds of raiding going on with other pastoral groups within Kenya. So one of the hugest tensions occur between the Turkana and the Pokot. The Pokot are to the south of the Turkana. They're well within Kenya. They're, but with Samburu, with Rendile, so the Turkana are raiding not just people in Sudan and Uganda. They're raiding the Borana, the Rendile, the Samburu, the Pokot, and in this other study, the second study, all of our groups were within Kenya just because logistically that was the population we had access to, and we still see those sharp decline in cooperation when you cross that cultural boundary. But yeah, that's a good question.
This question's based off of finding that the Kwatela are more likely to cooperate with, I think it's the Yukamong than the ethnic group to the north. I'm not sure if this is really like an alternative hypothesis, but have you considered the possibility that like those groups both consider themselves like Turkana, and that's how they delineate the group? Maybe they also like share members or share like badges of identity or something to where they can tell that they're all Turkana, or at least they talk about themselves like they're Turkana. And like throughout most of our evolutionary history, like that was probably a reliable signal of group membership. Failing to cooperate with a group member would have been really bad for your own reputation, status, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So the interesting thing that you're bringing up is basically we see this pattern emerging that, you know, ethno-linguistic boundaries actually seem like very important boundaries along which people fight and people cooperate and things like that. The question though is why? So what we're trying to provide is an evolutionary mechanistic account for why you should get norms that support cooperation at that scale, because that is not something that comes as a given with the underlying evolutionary mechanisms of cooperation. So punishment doesn't tell you who the in-group should be and who the out-group should be. We still need something else that needs to give us a particular set of people with a particular set of traits that become part of the in-group versus the out-group. And what cultural group selection will say is that that particular group will be a set of people who have shared norms about a bunch of things, not necessarily everything, and in some cases it might just be a few things, but those are the things that generated the group expansions and the group success. Also, this does not, also in this space, we are open to the possibility that different norms could operate at different scales. So you could have some norms that tell you, you know, cooperate with your clan members, and some norms that tell you cooperate with your ethno-linguistic group members. There isn't a automatic in-group and out-group. When you get, one of the big things that has happened in recent human history is that ethno-linguistic groups became less important as bigger cultural groups started to emerge, like groups that like world religions or nation states or state level societies. So these are now creating rules at a bigger social scale, and then you're going to expect that cultural group selection like processes are going to operate around these bigger cultural boundaries and generate cooperation at these even larger scales. So in some ways, you're right that this is essentially identifying the in-group and the out-group, but here what we're focused on is a mechanism by which a certain group of people get labeled as the in-group and a certain group of people get labeled as the out-group, and who that should be, because across human history, sometimes that is your other clan member, another clan is your out-group, another village is your out-group, and sometimes it is, you know, somebody who is, 500 kilometers away is still part of your in-group, right? So this is the process that is telling us mechanistically what's generating that. And then if you're curious about what generates variation in the scale of cultural differentiation, that will have to do with processes about how people interact with each other, how commonly you will run into each other. So, you know, in New Guinea, for instance, you have cultural variation at very small social scales because there's not much interaction between groups that are living in different valleys.
But in a lot of pastoral groups, you have cultural homogeneity across big social scales because people are moving, they're interacting, and you can maintain cultural homogeneity at a much larger scale. State level societies, once you get transportation, you build roads, you can get, or you get a king that puts on a slab that says this is the law and puts it around in various parts of the state, you can get convergence at a much bigger social scale. So the scale of cultural differentiation can change because of how people interact, because of the technologies that allow for transportation, trade, and those kinds of things. But that cultural group selection story says that that scale of cultural differentiation then has an effect on changing the scale at which cultural group selection is operating, and therefore you'll start to get the emergence of norms that confer benefits at these different scales.
I have a comment and a question. I've seen psychiatrists do a lot of cogitating about, why different symptoms hang together in a syndrome and why this group and that group and grouping. And this is a really good example of how an evolutionary perspective can really help illuminate why a disorder has this form that it does. So I really like that. Anne may disagree, but my question is about genders. Are the warriors and your subjects all men, or are there any? That's what I would expect.
Yeah, so for the PTSD study, so the warriors are all male. So only men go on raids, but women do get subject to the risk of raids when they're being attacked. And sometimes they actually do participate in the fighting. If there's an extra weapon or so, they'll take it and they'll fire back when their homesteads are being attacked. We haven't yet done a study on PTSD in women. They could potentially experience combat-related PTSD from being, being attacked during these raids. But that is something that, we think we might want to do going forward. There's a study in the Samburu that has looked at both men and women and shown that Samburu women have high rates of PTSD from one of the biggest sources of trauma is loss of a child and loss of animals, and child mortality rates are pretty high. So there's, PTSD from these other kind of sources of trauma.
So now that I've had a chance to look at this, so why did you say you think that depression is more common among the American soldiers?
Yeah, so that is a tentative story because the interesting thing is that we wanted to be able to look at what are the predictors in the US for these different symptoms, just like we did in the Turkana. But that data don't exist, or at least it's not published, because the clinical literature on PTSD has always lumped PTSD into a total score and done all the analysis using.
Psychiatry doesn't make these distinctions.
What's that?
So psychiatry is not making those distinctions.
It's not separating. So the people have looked at how there are different kind of clouds of symptoms, but it's not divided in a functional sort of way. So it's not following exactly there are other ways in which people have grouped it, more that come out of statistically looking at the different clouds of symptoms, but not, functionally saying this set of symptoms serve this purpose. This set of symptoms is serving the purpose of, so there actually has been a lot of talk about moral injury in the US when it comes to combat-related PTSD. But again, that is always talk about PTSD as a whole without explicitly saying, okay, these set of symptoms we think might come from moral injury and these might not. It's more about mental health problems broadly speaking. PTSD, depression in veterans are coming from.
So we regularly send our military to do things that most citizens don't agree with us being involved in. Is that the problem?
Yeah, so that's a part of what we think is the main population level differences. So in these kind of expeditionary militaries, one thing is that military norms, the military members are embedded into a normative system that then diverges quite a bit from the civilian normative system. And so when they come back, and the transition to being a veteran is one of the times in which PTSD goes up, is basically when they're confronted then with a normative system that is very different and sometimes in opposition of the kinds of value systems that were encouraged in the military context. And it's clear that there is a huge need for enculturation to make somebody a successful soldier, which is why the US military spends tons of money in the starting when they recruit people into the army. There's tons of investment in enculturating these people. Training, boot camp, lots of different kinds of hazing, because you need a new kind of normative system in order to function well.
Or stop sending our military to wars that we don't support. That would be another solution.
That would be another
And I can see why this would be hard to really get out there, right?
Yeah, so that's the other thing. When you get state level societies, a lot of people are fighting in wars that they don't have as much moral autonomy. They are sent, if they're in the military, they're sent to a war, they have to go to that war. They can't pick and choose. And once they're there, what their leaders say in these hierarchical systems, they have to go along with. Whereas in this more egalitarian system, you have strong norms about cowardice and desertion, but you don't have strong norms about how to treat the enemy. So if you want to, do greater collateral damage, you do it, and you're not judged by others for it, and vice versa. So you don't have, there are lots of differences between these two systems in which the general trend is that there's more risk of committing a norm violation in combat, being forced to commit a norm violation. If your leader says you have to do something, you have to go along with it. And also that there are really strong norms about collateral damage that has emerged in international war that can make the decisions really complicated and can almost make it such that you can never get it right. That is, you're often having to make trade-offs between the success of the mission, the safety of your fellow combatants, and the larger, the civilian damage. And so a lot of things are pointing in the direction of more risk of moral violations for an individual soldier in the US context compared to the Turkana context. And of course, in the Turkana, everybody endorses going on these raids, women, children, elders, they're blessed, they're sang for, there's feasts. So there's a very strong signal that when people go on raids, that's the right thing to do. When you kill an enemy, that's an even better thing to do. Interestingly though, about that point of killing enemy, in the US, one of the things people have shown is that having killed in combat increases your risk of experiencing depression and some of the mental health consequences. And in the Turkana, we had predicted that you won't find that effect because there's such strong norms allowing for killing, celebration of killing. It's not just allowing it, but celebrating it.
Is there data on killing in non-combat situations?
Is there what?
Is there also data on the killing in non-combat situations?
No, not that we have.
Does anybody, yeah, in
Um,
terms of the likely, because it seems that would be
yeah.
even more likely to cause depression,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, but most of the killing is happening in combat context, so there might not be as much. But if you look at this, you will see, I went by this very fast, but the pluses mean that it has a positive effect on these symptoms. And if you see killing all the way down there, K has, even in the Turkana, actually a positive effect on depressive symptoms. So having killed in combat despite all the cultural norms that tell you that this is the right thing that you should be doing is contra our prediction associated with increased risk of depressive symptoms. So there's something special about killing. And in the Turkana context, they also have a bunch of rituals in which they cleanse people who are killed in combat. So they definitely celebrate them, but it's also believed that they will waste away, they'll be haunted by the ghosts of the enemy. They need to be cleansed. And so there are these rituals that are meant to reduce those negative effects. So killing does seem to be cross-culturally a morally, there's a default that people go into kind of protecting against the danger of having committed that norm violation, even when there are strong norms about it. I thought I turned my phone on to do not disturb. Any last question?
Actually,
Okay.
could you talk a little bit more about what happens to the people who like turn back or they have like a premonition that they're gonna get hurt?
So desertion, that is you go along with the raid and then you turn back.
Yeah.
As opposed to cowardice, where you're on the raid, but you're kind of standing in the back. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. What happens to the people who desert early?
Yeah. So deserters face some sanctions, but it is to a lesser degree than cowardice. And essentially, the harm that's caused by desertion is that, you know, you're reducing the number of people who are out there fighting. But you showed that you wanted to go, but a lot of times people go and then they, on their way back, they leave saying that their dad called them back or their brother called them back, or they heard that somebody, they heard that somebody was in need, somebody was sick, their wife is sick, etc. And some of the times you don't know how to interpret that. Whereas if somebody's a coward on the battlefield, you know how to interpret that more clearly, right? So there could be a real reason why somebody was called back. People do get called back because their animals are at risk. They're leaving their animals with somebody else to herd, and so their dad might say, hey, that person is not there, come back, I need you to herd the animals and things like that. Or you can feel ill, you can get injured. But when you're out there on the battlefield and you're a coward, it's a much stronger signal that, you know, you're doing something that you shouldn't be doing. Also, cowards are potentially still getting a share of the loot, whereas deserters are not. So once you leave the raiding party, you're not considered part of it. You're not included in the way that loot is getting divided. Yes.
So when you were answering Dr. Strassman's question, I kind of got the impression that in the norms for the rating, it's kind of a dynamic observation of each individual and tolerance and a lot of correction of a behavior and then punishment. And then you mentioned that the Sambu had lower rates of successful raids. I was wondering if you knew anything about the systems for punishment.
Yeah. So one key difference between the Samburu and the Turkana systems is that the Samburu have this Moran period in which the young unmarried men are going and living off by themselves, and they are the ones who go and fight. They can be punished, they can be beaten, but then once you get married, you are graduated into elder status. You don't go on raids, and it is very, very, it's unheard of for people to sanction these older people who are basically past these Moran stage. In the Turkana, a 55-year-old man can get beaten by his age mates. He is an elder, he's there in all the important meetings, being a mediator, etc. one day, and a month later he commits a violation, he can be beaten. And so it's not like there's a protected group of people. Everybody's subject to the kind of expectations, certain expectations. And the Turkana also have people go on raids all the way until they cannot do it anymore because they're physically too weak to go on raids. There are 65-year-old men who go on raids. And so the raiding parties can potentially be larger because of that. That's maybe two of the things that stand out as differences, but I'm sure that there are other subtle differences that we don't know, and it could very well be that it's those things that we don't know that are actually driving the differences. This could all be a red herring in terms of which is the trait that is driving the success of the group.
I think your interpretation allows for the possibility that a group might be successful based on something that has to do with luck, like just better soil for, do they grow anything or is it all hurting?
In some areas, there's soil
that.
being cultivated,
Or something else in the culture that would be, let's say, these things you measure, okay, but then you have something else in the culture that is a certain type of agriculture that makes them all healthier and more fertile than the other groups, and so they're successful. And then they also have these norms that other people are adopting because it looks successful and you don't even know.
Exactly.
They might not actually be contributing to their fitness at all.
Exactly,
right?
yes.
Yeah.
So a whole bunch of norms that people are copying from successful groups or successful groups are imposing on other groups are probably norms that are just along for the ride. They're not the norm that's driving the success. I'm sure that, that's happening all the time. It's really only going to be through looking statistically if some trait is giving these people an advantage that's like independent of their ecology and things like that, then even as they grow and expand, you'll still see that they're able to maintain that success. Then okay, it's maybe not something that was particularly localized, it's something that they're still carrying with them.
It could take a long time. I mean, if smoking was considered to be an act of the successful in our culture for a long time.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Okay, well, I think you've answered an awful lot of questions, so thank you so much.